According to the Equal Justice Initiative, EJI, across the United States, there are over 2,200 juveniles serving life sentences without the possibility of parole, 60% of whom are Black. The EJI has found that children as young as 13 have been sentenced to life in prison without parole. The Campaign for Youth Justice also notes a trend to try youthful offenders as adults. It found that only less than 5% of youths are arrested for murder, rape, robbery, and aggravated assault, and yet the number of youth in adult prisons have been on the rise.
I don't understand why you would punish a juvenile the same way you would punish an adult, because they don't have the same decision-making facilities, They don't have the mental processes that adults have.
No, I don't think juveniles should go to adult prisons, and I don't really think adults should go to adult prisons either. Juveniles going to adult prisons is just sending them to a place that's not even suitable for adults.
I don't think they should be sent to adult prisons. Kids have different maturity levels than adults. It's not the same.
The Supreme Court ruled earlier this year that mandatory life without parole sentences for juvenile offenders ages 17 and under are unconstitutional. However, the ruling does not automatically free any of the over 2,200 prisoners serving life sentences for crimes committed as juveniles we talked about earlier. Nor does it forbid such life terms for youth convicted of homicide. Rather, sentencing judges must first take into account the offender's age, the nature of the crime, and other mitigating factors.
Most states at this point have decided that youth that are above the age of 17 or 18 are tried as adults, and they are sentenced to adult prison. However, in New York State and in North Carolina, which are the last two states in the union, they have kept law that states that youth as young as 16 can be charged as adults and sentenced to adult prisons. And so there's one factor is age. So if you're 16 years old in New York State and North Carolina, then you can still be tried as an adult and go to an adult prison. In other states, 17 or 18, and even some states 19 is the age of majority in which you can be charged as an adult. The other considerations, and this is nationwide, is the type of crime. So, for example, if a young person commits a crime of murder, or if the judge feels like the crime is egregious enough, or the manner in which it was conducted was egregious enough, a young person can also receive time in adult prison. So some young people as young as 13 have been tried as adults in the past.
And while it's against the federal law for prisons not to have a separate facility for youth being tried as adults or a separate juvenile detention center, space is often limited.
However, when we talk about, the consequences of youth being in prisons, adult prisons, that can also serve as a consequence, because in some states, the juvenile area is not large enough for young people to interact with other young people, or they just don't have as many young people in there. So youth are sometimes kept in what we call confinement or solitary confinement because of the nature of their age.
Rukia Lumumba is Director of Youth Services at the Center for Community Alternatives, the first sentencing advocacy program in New York State, and New York's only program designed specifically for youth under 16 who are charged as adults. Through her leadership of the youth program at the Center for Community Alternatives, she is advocating to raise the age of majority in New York State.
Because at age 16, a young person is really a teenager, and their development mentally is far behind that of an adult as it relates to understanding the consequences of their responsibility to the point where they can appreciate it and make better decisions.
This makes them more likely to engage in risky behavior. Advocacy groups and the Campaign for Youth Justice argue that life sentences for youth without parole should be considered cruel and unusual punishment. Further, the practice of sentencing juveniles to adult prisons harms their development and prevents them from reaching maturity that would have been afforded to them in age-appropriate environments. Lumumba notes that many adult prisons don't offer youth the opportunity to finish their mandatory education and puts them at greater risk for sexual assault and recidivism than youth lockups.
Young people who are in jeopardy of being beaten, by staff. This is an outcome. Young people are 50% more likely to be threatened with weapons or be harmed with weapons by other inmates when they're younger. And the recidivism rates, in terms of talking about outcomes after they leave prison, the recidivism rates are also pretty high for young people that have served time in adult prisons. And mainly this occurs because in adult prisons, there's not a youth development focus. There are not programs put in place that really focus on helping youth become productive adults. And so as a result, youth lack the interaction, the positive interaction with other adults and the learning experiences that they need to become productive adults.
Rukia adds that studies of neuroscience research prove that there are physical differences between the brains of adults and juveniles.
There are three key things that differentiate young people from adults. One is that the lack of maturity is a lack of maturity and an inability to appreciate the consequences of their actions. Another one is that juveniles are more vulnerable and they're susceptible to negative influences and especially acceptable to outside pressures, including peer pressure. And so that's a really big one. And then the third one is that juveniles have not developed their personality traits yet. And as a result, they tend to be more impulsive in their decisions, and their personalities are more transitory. And so it's less fixed. So they jump from place to place. And in time, they develop into more mature. All of these traits and characteristics develop, and they become more mature and are able to make better decisions. But when that process is hindered by being placed in a setting where they are confined and they are placed in a punitive type of environment where their brains are not challenged, where they're not engaging in positive activities and around positive adults and positive youth development approaches, then that bars their brain from developing further and triggering the maturity level that they need to have reached at that point.
And then there's the issue of taxpayer dollars. It costs significantly less to place a young adult in a rehabilitation program than in prison.
For example, if we just talk about incarcerating a young person in just a detention facility versus sending them to an alternative to incarceration program, you're saving over hundreds of thousands of dollars. It costs about $225,000 to incarcerate a young person versus approximately $10,000 to $15,000 to send them to an alternative to incarceration program in their community. So the cost savings for taxpayers is huge. And those cost savings are comparable when you talk about youth being imprisoned in adult prison facilities.
Rukia says that reform in the justice system is challenging today because of a number of reasons.
There's money in institutions. And so there is a such thing as mass incarceration and a profit for mass incarceration. But outside of that, you know, our prison system was created for punitive purposes, right? When the United States developed the prison system, it was for punitive instead of rehabilitation. And so as a result, throughout the years, we have come further and further away from that, but we still have ways to go. And so it takes time to change minds.
In New York City's juvenile facilities, Rukia reiterates that the focus has been to incorporate more educational enrichment activities, an opportunity the youth will not have in an adult facility. However, more needs to be done.
For example, in Rikers Island, they have included organizations such as Voices Unbroken, which provides poetry workshops for young people that are confined in Rikers Island. And they have, you know, by law, they're required to provide educational services for young people. And, you know, they provide some mental health services. But the effectiveness and efficiency of those services are far below what they need to be. The other thing that's a big problem is that even though there's some programs there, and I want to be clear that there's some, there needs to be a lot more. And I appreciate the fact that the city has really, the Department of Corrections has really tried, Division of Corrections has really tried to put in more, but a lot more needs to be put in. And the thing is that when they're being placed in, what most young people are saying that that hinders their development is that these things are considered privileges. and are not considered mandatory, right, in terms of something that can't be stripped from them. So when you have, for example, an enrichment activity, say it's the Voices Unbroken workshop, and because you committed any minor violation, whether it's talking back to a correctional officer or not walking down the line properly or numerous other offenses, when that's stripped away from you and you have to now spend 2 hours in your cell for that minor infraction, and therefore you miss your library time or you miss your ability to participate in an enrichment workshop, that harms a person. That truly does not help in their development. So what we need to have happen is that these type of enrichment programs, these type of academic programs, library time, all of these type of things that help a person's mind develop needs to be considered a necessity and not a privilege.
According to the Campaign for Youth Justice, juveniles who participate in education programs while incarcerated are 3 times less likely to be reincarcerated. Melissa Gelber is Deputy Project Director of the Brownsville Community Justice Center at the Center for Court Innovation, which helps the justice system aid victims, reduce crime, and improve public trust in justice. The center grew out of a single experiment in judicial problem solving. The Midtown Community Center was created back in 1993 to address low-level offending around Times Square. It combined punishment and help, sentencing offenders to perform community service and receive social services. The project's perceived success in making justice more visible led to the establishment of the Center for Court Innovation to serve as an engine for ongoing court reform in New York.
You don't want to have low-risk kids involved in programs that might be more detrimental to them as opposed to positive for them. A lot of the research shows that the less intervention that a low-risk youth receives, the better off that they're going to be. Maybe they made a very minor mistake, and they can just kind of keep it moving with their family's supervision and support. Moderate risk kids might need a higher level of care, and that is where the alternative to detention services come into play. For those young people who've been deemed high risk on this validated instrument, those young people may need the services that are in fact in the detention setting.
Gilbert says that it's important to create viable off-ramps for juveniles who have gone through the justice system so they won't have to be confined in detention through the pendency of their case, and to have community-based services that meet their needs to reduce the reliance on incarceration. She adds that especially for juvenile offenders, the collateral consequences for being involved in the system are many and diverse.
Young people that we have worked with, particularly on Staten Island and in Queens, where we run our alternative to detention programs, we started seeing very early on that many young people were overage and undercredited in terms of their educational needs. Many of them were experiencing comorbidity, meaning that they had mental illness needs as well as substance abuse issues. Many of them were not receiving the services that they very much were in desperate need of. And when judges would see them, they would say, okay, well, we have to put them in a secure setting because they are, not getting what they need. Unfortunately, a lot of the facilities don't have all of the services and all of the rich array of resources that the community does. So even though the judge was trying to do something positive, get this young person, perhaps, different counseling and things that they might need, that wasn't always happening. And so, taking into consideration that the main reason to confine a young person would be, the public safety risk and or whether they were going to fail to appear at subsequent court hearings, that left a whole host of young people who could be deemed moderate risk that could be supervised appropriately in the community if they were given various services.
Gilbert notes that when young people are involved in the juvenile justice system and found to be a juvenile delinquent in need of supervision and are ultimately confined in placement or detention, once they return to the community, often as young as 16, if they are rearrested, they may be looking at jail time.
In the juvenile justice system, whatever has transpired really shouldn't impact the criminal justice system process. Perhaps you would get a fine, maybe you would get a violation. maybe you do community service, but for some young people who don't have stable housing, have been disengaged from school, have family volatility, again, have mental health or substance abuse needs, if they're facing jail time based on whatever it is that they have done, again, it would have to rise to the level maybe of a felony as opposed to a misdemeanor. They would be really behind the 8 ball in a lot of ways. They've already been through the juvenile justice system. They haven't been in their community. They are not linked to, any supportive services, and they're just becoming more and more institutionalized. They're not given access anymore to how they're going to be able to get on the right track. Instead, they're just becoming deeper and deeper into these systems that have a hold on them and are less likely to give them the opportunity once they are released from jail to get access to viable educational or vocational opportunities. So it really is something that we are working very hard to stave off, because we don't really see positive outcomes from young people either being in confinement in the juvenile system, and certainly here in New York with the age of majority being 16, it's not a good outcome if young people continue to be wrapped up in these systems and see themselves in either jail or prison.
She notes that with proper assessment, someone's life can easily be turned around.
Because again, you don't want to just capriciously put a young person into detention when they can be adequately supervised and served within the community. You don't want to take a young person from their family, from their school, from their faith-based organization.
Yes, I think kids should be given a second chance to learn from their mistakes. Rehabilitation programs would be beneficial, I think, to them.
According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, there are an estimated 2.3 million children who have a parent in jail. More than 7 million children have a parent under some form of correctional supervision. And since we focus on the mental and emotional toll of juvenile incarceration, we thought it would be important to turn the tables and talk about the children of incarcerated parents as well. Since 1991, the number of children with parents in prison has increased by more than 50%.
I didn't know the numbers were that large. I do think the government has some sort of responsibility to take care of these kids who obviously aren't being well taken care of by their parents if their parents are incarcerated.
Of the 2.7 million children who have a parent behind bars, 2/3 of those parents are incarcerated for a nonviolent offense. What happens to the children when they lose a parent? Well, economic stability is one. Confusion, anger, stigma, feeling that they're stigmatized by people around them. The promise of their future is imperiled. In no way do I want to present these children as destined to be incarcerated. They're absolutely wonderful, bright, loving kids like any of our children. In New York State, we have nothing in place to address what happens to children at the moment of parental arrest.
Marika Toronto is the director and producer of the documentary The Word is Love, which gives the children of incarcerated parents the opportunity to tell their stories through their own voice, one that is seldom heard. Toronto has spent the last 10 years working on the film and says despite the numbers, the children of the incarcerated have so far remained invisible.
Hi, my name is Asmani Muzon, and I'm gonna be 10 in September 7th. Right now I'm 9.
Asmani, do you remember when you were little and you were with your mom?
No.
How old were you when your mom went away? Asmani? Can you tell me why you're crying?
Cops, they knocked and we let them in. And when they came in, I called my mother and her cell phone. When she came, I started crying. My grandmother, she was scared. She started crying. She started asking the police in Spanish to let her go. The day my mother went went to jail, I didn't know. My sister told me the next day, and I just started crying and crying. I couldn't stop. I was like, why my mother? Why my mother? The first day I went to go see my mother, I was excited because I'm finally meeting to see my mother in prison. But that was like 5 months, 7 months after she was locked up. When we got there, I had on boots. It was snowing. It was real cold. Then I got there, they made me take off my boots and made me dig in my pockets, take out everything. It felt like I was stripping, like I was in a stripping club or something. So we went through, they made me get the stain on my left hand, something that if I don't have it, they're gonna make me stay in there.
The Sentencing Project in March of 2012, and I'm quoting here, says that more than a quarter of juvenile lifers have had a parent in prison, and 59.1% of juvenile lifers have had a close relative in prison. There are further statistics which are disputed again by many advocates that state that without significant intervention, more than 1 in 10 children will end up in prison. Why? Lots of reasons. The communities that are most decimated by incarceration are communities that are also decimated by poverty, by sometimes lack of education through no fault of anyone's, but that the schools are being closed or they're not terrific.
And while, according to the Sentencing Project advocacy group, children of incarcerated parents are more likely to drop out of school, engage in delinquency, and subsequently be incarcerated themselves, Marika and others have stressed that this should not be represented as appealing to all children of incarcerated parents.
In New York State, most of the prisons are an 8-hour bus ride, 6 to 8 hour bus ride from the place of arrest. So you can imagine not seeing your mother or father for some time, then, as one of the kids describes, maybe 8 months after the incarceration, taking a bus up to near the New York-Canada border, which is where Albion is. That's a women's correctional facility. Think about that. Think about not seeing a mother or father, then seeing them in those conditions looking completely different than what you were used to. In an orange jumpsuit, maybe hair cut, cuffed, guards with guns all around you. What is the bus ride home like?
She notes that until there is a national dialogue about the consequences of incarceration, things will not get better before they get worse.
Have you heard anything in the recent presidential debates about the cost of incarceration, about the cost of a child being in foster care or in juvenile detention for a year? No, we don't hear this. If you're talking about an economic issue, I'd like to hear someone address it. We certainly have ways of redirecting those funds that can assure a productive future for these children and for us, because we're going to be depending on them, aren't we?
I know when my mother come out, she gonna be there for me. She gonna do everything she can to get back in my life, to have a better relationship with me. So I stay with her, I keep loving her. My love will never go out for her. It will never run out. Right now, something to make me happy if my mother come out of jail right now. In the future, I'm a change. I'm not gonna skip one day of school. Every day I'm gonna go to school, make a good education, get a good job. Just being good. Just being like my mother.
I got a comment from someone who said, "These look like normal children." I don't know what they expected. These are normal children who are facing an enormous challenge. I hope that everyone will realize that there's something they can do. What can you do? You can change the way you vote. You can change the way you think. You can mentor. You can tutor. You can contribute money. There's something each and every person can do to change this. Because you know what? With 1 in every 100 Americans being incarcerated, could be your child, couldn't it?
I mean, if we're going to pay to keep their parents inactive and non-contributing and unable to help them, we should pay to get them the help they need.